Hi, we're so glad to have you here tonight. We had some declines. I didn't realize that Mr. Obama would decide to have his television program tonight. And of course, none of us would have anticipated the third night for one World Series game. So at any rate, we think you've made a great choice. Our speaker tonight spoke at the library in September, and he was just marvelous. I have to say, the book is a wonderful book. He has lots of stories about Ford and Nixon, and lots of other people who will be familiar to you, for those of you who are regulars. So let me tell you a little bit about Dale Van Atta. Dale is an investigative reporter and a novelist, and has authored a biography of General Norman Schwarzkopf and also a history of the AARP. He had probed deeply into the underworld of Middle East terrorism long before 9/11 occurred. He was a personal friend of journalist Jack Anderson, who many of you would be familiar with, and he co-wrote the column Washington Merry-Go-Round for many years. Dale's investigative reporting focused on national security affairs, and I have to tell you, he had excellent sources. One of the most remarkable collections in the Gerald Ford Presidential Library is one that Dale himself donated. The Van Atta papers are a vast collection of CIA and other intelligence reports from the 1970s. So think about that, and maybe we can ask him how he got those and gave them to us. Tonight, though, he's here to talk about his book, With Honor, Melvin Laird in War, Peace, and Politics, which was researched in close collaboration with Secretary Laird over the past 8 years. As you might recall, Laird was a congressman from Wisconsin for 16 years before becoming Secretary of Defense against his will in the Nixon administration. And he played a key role in many critical decisions of the time. And I think that's what I found most fascinating about the book and about Dale's talk and when he spoke at the library. I really learned a lot. President Ford knew Melvin Laird quite well through their mutual service in Congress and the Nixon administration, and their membership in the Chowder and Marching Society, and also a prayer group. In writing the foreword to this book, President Ford stated, "Without Melvin Laird as our country's 10th Secretary of Defense, there would have been no end to the Vietnam War during the Nixon administration, no end to the draft, no steady military modernization during the country's most virulent anti-military years, and no arms control treaties with the Soviet Union." All of the staff at the Ford Library have had a keen interest in the publication of this authorized biography because it draws heavily on the extensive collection of personal papers that Secretary Laird donated to the library in the year 2000. Our staff have had numerous interactions with him over the years, and we're very grateful for Dale's donation of hundreds of oral history interviews that he conducted as a part of his research on this book. The book is a wonderful melange of insights and stories about Melvin Laird, Henry Kissinger, Presidents Ford and Nixon. And to tell you more about them, I want to invite Dale Van Atta to the podium. Dale, come on up.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I feel like you're a target here. Can I move this a little closer? Feels like it's further away.
Can we move it forward?
Yeah, can we just move it forward?
We can be informal here tonight. Let's not spill this.
See if they earn the money they get paid. Or we'll redistribute their wealth.
I want it noted for the record, it's not just women who move furniture.
I'm going to take my jacket off. I am delighted to be here. I am a great fan of Gerald Ford, and anyone who's a fan of his, I'm a friend too, I hope. But not all of his choices for cabinet members, as you'll soon learn. In honor of the election, I wanted to start out with two different stories, and I just wrote more about one, so I'm sorry that I may have to read a little of it. But has anybody heard the name Bill Ayers in this election? Yes, I'd like to start out with a little story about Bill Ayers. Just to give you a tone of what was happening at that time, before I tell you how Mel accepted to become Secretary of Defense under Nixon and why it was so difficult, you would know is because it was at the height of the most unpopular war we had had in many years. And in fact, for similar reasons, why do we have two men who want to be president now and one woman? What a time to become president. But when I was looking back at some of the events with Ayers, I think people have forgotten how virulent it was, would be the word, and how courageous Mel was in these circumstances. A lot of the anti-war protesters focused on events in your neighboring state of Wisconsin because Mel had come from Wisconsin. So on January 1st, 1970, 1:30 a.m., a group calling itself the Vanguard of the Revolution stole a twin-engine Cessna 150 used to train University of Wisconsin's ROTC flight cadets and flew 35 miles north to drop 3 bombs on the Badger Army ammunition depot. And when those bombs all proved to be duds, the next day the college newspaper, University of Wisconsin at Madison, said it was a wonderful thing and it's too bad that the bombs didn't go off. They were different times. In fact, across the country, in the 1969 to 1970 academic year, there were a total of 250 bombings and 247 cases of arson on and off campuses related to the war during that year. So it was a frequent event. In the wake of the Cambodia invasion of Kent State tragedy, on August 24th, 3:42 a.m., that same group that had stolen those bombs called 5 minutes ahead of a bomb going off prematurely at the Army Math Center at the University of Wisconsin. And killed was 33-year-old postdoctorate student doing research in the early morning hours, Dr. Robert Fessnet. Mel told me he took this very personally. I have been responsible for the Math Center. His mother was on the board, the University Board of Regents, the first woman to serve on that board. In the 1950s, I had put in the congressional appropriations for the Advanced Mathematics Facility. They thought they were getting even with me now that I was Secretary of Defense. It was intended to raise hell with me, a sort of retribution, and they killed that young man. Also the year Mel becomes Secretary of Defense, there's a very public, some of you remember the Students for Democratic Society, a very public walkout by a number of individuals who are saying they were not being radical enough at their 69 National Convention, and they formed a group called the Weather Underground. Does anybody remember why they called it that? It was all related to Bob Dylan songs. It was the song that said that you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. But during that year, one of the group's co-founders was Bernadine Dorn. You may or may not remember that name, became one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. But after Charlie Manson and his group had killed Sharon Tate and others and carved words in their stomachs, pig, she exulted and gave statements to the press saying, first they killed those pigs, then they ate dinner in the same room with them, then they even shoved a fork into a victim's stomach. Wild. Revolution was the order of the day for those urban guerrillas, and there was really a subtext of kids who were against their parents. Probably, if you've heard all this about Bill Ayers, you don't remember that he was the son of the wealthy chairman and CEO of Commonwealth Edison, Chicago's electric utility. He was a rich kid radical who spewed out generational venom. As the group's co-founder, he declared as one of its goals, quote, kill all the rich people, break up their cars and apartments, bring the revolution home, kill your parents, that's where it's really at. And he meant it at the time. The line was from the Subterranean Homesick Blues, but they started using kind of a slanguage to talk with each other. Whenever they were referring to dynamite, which they were beginning to use, they called it ice cream or pickles. The Pentagon was called Maggie's Farm, from a Bob Dylan song of that name when he said, I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more. Taking pickles to Maggie's farm became one of their great objects. In early 1973, weathermen worked in a Greenwich Village townhouse on a special bomb full of screws and nails because they wanted to maximize the casualty toll when it would be set off during a U.S. Army dance at nearby Fort Dix, New Jersey. There's no way to know how many dozens of soldiers and their dates might have been killed. As karma had it, the three mishandled the device and blew themselves up. The accident sent shockwaves through the Weather Underground and a reassessment. Bombs would in future be used as armed anecdotes, they called it, not devices whose purpose was to kill. Still, if someone happened to die from one of their bombs, it didn't matter. When Bill Ayers wrote his memoir, he said, there's something about, this is 2001, many years afterwards, there's something about a good bomb. There's a certain eloquence to bombs, a poetry and a pattern from a safe distance. His favorite target, he admitted in his memoir, was his army. Was the Pentagon. And was that because his father was once considered to become Secretary of the Army? He said no. It was the ground zero for war and conquest. It was a five-sided behemoth serving as the center of American military might. And of the Pentagon bombing, this is the first bombing of the Pentagon when Melvin Laird was Secretary of Defense. He wrote of that day, everything was absolutely ideal on the day I bombed the Pentagon. The sky was blue, the birds were singing, and the bastards were finally going to get what was coming to them. And who was the chief target? Of course, it was Laird himself. They spent several weeks planning it, a cell of 3 individuals whom he didn't name. A woman kept going into the Pentagon to case it and finally figured out a women's bathroom close to the Secretary of the Air Force, his office, and finally left a bomb, a lot of plastic explosive in a drain pipe there. It went off in the middle of a morning, and luckily no one was hurt. Mel was in Brussels at a NATO meeting, and they called him and said, "This is happening." He asked if anybody was hurt, and they said no. And he said, "Well, downplay it. Don't give them credit. Let's no retribution. Let's just, we can handle it, but let's not overreact." In fact, he was criticized for it. There was a Washington Post reporter named Carl Bernstein who said there was, quote, "extraordinarily muted reaction to the attack on the symbol of America's military establishment." A month after he wrote this was a bombing in '72, Bernstein reported on another incident, a pre-dawn break-in at the Watergate building complex, which would obviously have far greater repercussions. No one was ever arrested for the bombing of the Pentagon. And the man who spoke most about it at the time was a general named Chappie James, who Mel had promoted, and he became the first 4-star African-American general we had. But he said they didn't know no one would be there. It could have gone off in the daytime when a lot of people, several women would be using the bathroom. They did not care. Still no one was arrested. 2 of those responsible, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, were on the run for more than a decade. Dorn became one of the FBI's 10 most wanted. Edgar Hoover liked to call her the La Passionara of the lunatic left. Of course, Hoover had his own problems. After they had their second child together, Ayers and Dorn gave themselves up in 1981. They never served time in jail because the federal charges had to be dropped because of all the illegal wiretapping and things the Justice Department had brought against them. They married afterwards. Dorn became a professor at Northwestern University and a crusader for juvenile justice system reform, while Ayers became a professor of education at the University of Illinois in Chicago. In 2001, when he published his self-confessing, totally unapologetic memoir, Fugitive Days, he wrote, "I'd marched on the Pentagon more than once, scaled its walls, confronted armed troops there, and even peed on its side. If I could have, I'd have duct taped it shut or put it in a trash compactor, but the closest I could come was a bomb in the bathroom. I can't imagine anyone putting a bomb in a building today. All that seems so much a part of them. But," he said, and this was the irony, the great, terrible irony, or some might call it karma, his book was published in 2001. The beginning of his book tour was an interview with the very sympathetic New York Times on September 10th, 2001, which they published in their September 11th edition on the front page. And in this edition, he was quoted as saying, which unquestionably may have been the last thing some of those in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, for the New York Times has delivered, may have read, was this article about Bill Ayers, in which he said, "I don't regret setting bombs. In fact, I feel we didn't do enough. We didn't set enough of them." His book tour, thankfully, was canceled after the first stop. And of course, the only reason I'm referencing Ayers is because it's connected to the election today. There is a connection early on with the support of Obama at some point. Do I think Obama supports terrorists? No, I wasn't going there. I just thought you ought to know who there's this guy they keep mentioning. Second reference to the election today. I found it fascinating in the first debate that Henry Kissinger was referenced there by John McCain as a great friend of the last 30 years. Remember, they were kind of arguing about it back and forth. So I went back and looked at the history and all the interviews I had done, and I did a column for several newspapers and basically concluded that if Henry Kissinger had had his way in 1969, John McCain would only be the memory of a long-dead POW. Instead, because he didn't get his way and Mel did, McCain lived, and a lot of other POWs. McCain told me that before he was presidential candidate, about how that all the POWs felt they owed Mel their life. Now let me back up and I'll explain that a little more. I worked as a co-columnist with Jack Anderson for many years, and I thought, I'm an investigative reporter, but he kept telling me I was a muckraker, that he loved that term muckraker. Some of you know it comes from Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan, where he's raking in the muck all the time, never looking up and seeing the stars. And I resisted it until I was down in Antarctica. a couple of years into working for Jack, I was down there with some reputable journalists, one from Time Magazine, New York Times, and National Geographic. And we got all these briefings from scientists at the South Pole Station, geodesic dome on 9,000 feet of ice that's moving 10 feet a year. And they were telling us all these important things for a couple hours, and then we were let off on our own. Go ahead and interview whoever you wanted to. Well, our column was running in about 1,000 newspapers, and I thought, okay, I can do one column on the ozone layer, but I got to do stuff that people really want to read about. So one of the things I did quickly was about the 300 Club. I had heard from some sources at McMurdo Station that they'd use a sauna at the South Pole Station, jack it up to 200 degrees, go running out to the actual South Pole that keeps moving, just in their bunny boots when it was minus 100. Hence the 300 Club, 200 degrees plus, you run out, it's minus 100 degrees, you get your picture taken, you're part of the secret 300 Club. And of course, since males and females had joined, I went to see the doctor to talk about frostbite cases and see the secret scrapbook. And after I was done with him, there was this guy who approached me. He just didn't look all that smart, but you know, he said the one line I heard many times before and since. I have a story. If you're the guy with Jack Ashton, I have a story that's bigger than Watergate. Okay, tell me what you got. So I had to put all my 40 pounds of clothing on again to go outside the dome. And we went, there was this plastic manhole cover, I should have figured it out at that point, which he lifted. We went down these steps and along this tunnel, and then there's this large brown lake that seemed to be steaming, and of course the smell was overwhelming. And this is early 1980s. So it's before the environmentalists got there, I guess. And he said, you see the problem here? You see how it's melting ice above it? You don't realize it, but we walked back under the South Pole Station. He said, the South Pole Station is sinking a foot each year into its own whatever. And as I was looking at this, and this guy was going on about the story bigger than Watergate, I thought, okay, Jack, I'm here at the South Pole. I guess I am a muckraker. Most of the things I wrote and did over the years had to do with bringing people down who I felt deserved it. One of those people that I felt was a worthy target for many years and was Henry Kissinger. Not just because of his ego, but because I always considered him that a lot of things he did were for policy reasons. He didn't necessarily think about the soldiers who were fighting or the people we were aligning ourselves with. And I know some of you may be friends of his, and that's fine. But I became so well known to him as a nemesis that when a few years ago they dedicated the Laird Center in Marshfield, and I was already doing this book with Mel, he kept calling Mel and saying, is it going to be third person or is he writing it for you? I'll meet with him if you are doing it as an autobiography. But when he told him, no, I'm having him do it third person, he said, well, I don't know if I'll meet with him. I got kicked off a plane for that, from Washington for that dedication. It was for some senator or his wife or something, and then went on to a commercial airline. I was going to go on a private plane. So the secretary called me and said, you know, it's terrible, we're doing this to you, I hope you'll take it. I said, I'll take it, but I want to make a deal with you. Put me next to Henry Kissinger at the lunch table. At the lunch table after the dedication. You're doing all the seat assignments. I'm fine with flying commercial. I've always done that. But put me next to him. She said, fine. So I wanted to make sure it would happen. So after the dedication and people were being let out, I ran over to the room to make sure I was next to Henry Kissinger. I just wanted to talk with him and ease his feelings somewhat. The next person out of the room, within minutes, I don't know how he managed to avoid everybody talking to him, was Henry Kissinger with his bodyguard. So I melted off in the corner. We had never personally met. I mean, Jack Ashton had been on his case for years, and I probably took a lot of that from Jack. And I saw him go to the table and just blanch when he saw that I was sitting next to him. He lifted my card up, went to a whole other table, 4 or 5 tables away, found a lady he wanted to sit next to, moved her card back over there, and left the room. Hence his mistake. I went hard back, put it next to him. So, you know, it's hard to fluster Mr. Kissinger, but he was. And we got along well, actually. I had always felt some criticism, yes, it was unfair. I had peace with him about several things. But one of the reasons that I did the book, very frankly, was when I came to realize Kissinger had gotten credit for a number of things that Mel had actually done. Not only that, I felt, when I finally interviewed Mr. Kissinger, that he was magnanimous enough to admit that. And it was interesting, because one of the things we talked about when I met with him was, why was it is clear to me that you and Nixon, the President of the United States, were afraid of Mel? Why were you so wary of him? He said, well, because he had all the friends on the Hill. I had none. I had just been at Harvard. And so I wasn't necessarily totally prepared for being in this new bureaucracy. And I had no friends in the media. And he had many more friends in the media than Nixon could ever dream of. After all those years working with Ford and working with the media, where they were very open, sometimes becoming great sources for the media about the terrible things the Democrats were doing, but they were well regarded. So Mel was in a better position. He said, you know, I tried to once get rid of this Fort DeRussy, this nice recreation center for the Army on Waikiki Beach, which you could sell for a lot of money, and it's still owned by the Army. But Mel felt it was really important for the troops coming back from Vietnam, and then before they go back to recreate there. So when we were talking about it in the White House, within a couple hours, I don't even know how he found out, there was a Senate resolution forbidding us from selling Fort DeRussy, saying that there would have to be a congressional act, a bill that was passed to sell Fort DeRussy. Said we were very concerned about that. Elaine referenced the fact that he was unwillingly dragged into being Secretary of Defense, and that was the case. And one of the things that I would say gives me great hope about the future, and I would say this no matter who's elected president, is that even today, in other places that I talk, those of you who are familiar with Ford would probably be familiar with Laird to a degree, but there are quite a few people who don't know his name, and not necessarily a lot who knew then what he was doing, and yet he was able to do so much as Secretary of Defense, an extraordinary amount of work and great things for America, with or without the President. I have hope there are such men and women, whoever is elected President. And the more interesting period to me is the post-election period, when I look at who their cabinet choices are going to be, because we could get some real wonderful patriots with either candidate that will help this country move during these next few years when we're having such difficulty. Mel was, there were a lot of times I talked with him about Ford, because I know there were a number of times he was promoted ahead of Ford in the House. When they said, well, why don't you run for this office? Those of you who know Ford's history know that Mel and Don Rumsfeld and a couple others, the Young Turks they called them back then, twice unseated first the Speaker of the House, who was Republican, and then later the minority leader, who was Republican, which moved Ford forward and Laird just behind him. Mel always felt Ford was a better front person. He would always maintain, you know, people are foolish if they think Ford is not smart, because he's very smart. He just doesn't always show it. And Mel was his idea man. Mel was the head of the House Republican caucus. Even while he was head of the House Republican caucus, not well known, one of his interns, 1968, a young lady from Wellesley College named Hillary Rodham. That was an interesting interview. On Saturday, I interviewed her on Monday at the White House when she was First Lady. It had been arranged for 6 months to talk about being an intern to Mel Laird. And on Saturday, the Monica Lewinsky story had broke. So it was a little nerve-wracking. She canceled everything except that interview that day, which tells you a little about her respect for Laird. And she said, you know, that he was an amazing person. And one of the things I really critically wanted from her is what her opinion was of how he felt toward women. Was he truly for equality or not? Because I figured Hillary would know even at that time. She said, yeah, I had great antenna for it, and he really was. Mel really loved, more than working with Ford on the Defense Appropriations Committee, most of you know Ford did tremendous work there with Mel helping him, because Mel was just behind him. Ford was the ranking member on Defense Appropriations. Together they pushed through the Polaris submarines, so they pushed through a number of things that Eisenhower didn't even want, but they felt were vital. They ended up being right. But Mel was also the ranking member of the Health Appropriations Subcommittee. So between the two committees, he was overseeing 70% of the U.S. budget. It gave him extraordinary clout, especially in those days when the Appropriations Committee was far more important. There were only 4 committees that you needed to now there are 8 committees to get various appropriations and budget bills through. And he loved doing this work on this Health Appropriations Subcommittee. That was where his heart really was. So he and Ford would argue. Ford would say, we need to put more money into space. There'll be military applications and other things. And Mel would argue back and say, I'd rather be first in health for all Americans than first in space or on the moon. And it was a nice little debate they had over time. But when Nixon is finally elected with Ford and Laird's help, they're mutual friends. They're all three in the Chowder and Marching Society for all those years. Laird is concerned about being tapped as a cabinet member. He's told Nixon, I don't want to be it. So instead, in a particularly Laird way, he promoted someone for every position. And half the cabinet choices were ones he originally suggested to Richard Nixon. In fact, he was the person who suggested Henry Kissinger for National Security Advisor. Nixon had never met Kissinger until Ford said, this is the guy you really ought to have. I worked with him in '64 on the Republican platform, and he was great. He's a brilliant man. He's the guy you need to have there. So, but by promoting other people, he couldn't promote somebody for help. He couldn't figure out somebody, so Nixon called him. One of the anecdotes I kind of never forget are images of the way Laird was. And really, they're cut out of the same mold. And I think of Laird, I also think of Ford, because it's this Midwest pragmatism, these great American personalities. He worked a lot of years bipartisan with John Fogerty to put tremendous funding for the NIH through. I mean, that grew 10 times during the 10 years he and Fogerty were funding it. CDC, I mean, the reason they're great today is because of that 1950s golden funding these two men did. And during that time, one of the things Fogerty asked him was to go through a list every year, go see these various places and see if they need more funding. So he agreed to do that, and Fogerty died. And after Nixon was elected, to live up to his pledge to Fogerty, the week after Nixon was elected, he went down to the only leprosarium we had in the United States at the time, which was down in Carville, Louisiana. And yes, it's the Carville family, James Carville. He gave a dedication down there once. But at that time, we're talking about the late 60s, still there was concern about leprosy. It was hard to see people who were leprous, and there was still a concern that Hansen's disease might be communicable. So he went down there with a friend, and the friend was just totally, I guess freaked out would be the one word you might want to use. He asked the doctor that he met at the gate if he could have gloves so he wouldn't shake hands with anybody that had the disease, and found it hard to look at people. It happened that the day that Mel went there, they had a dance for 2 hours. And Mel danced with all the women for 2 hours without gloves, no matter what they looked like, and smiled and enjoyed himself. And I've always thought of that as a great symbol because these were good people dancing with lepers. The real dancing with lepers was what happens later on, late in the administration with Watergate and the other things that went on. But as he came back from that dance that night, Nixon called him at the hotel in New Orleans, asked him to be Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and he said, absolutely not. The Secretary has no power. I have power as the ranking member. I can do more than any Secretary can ever do, so you need to keep me in Congress to do this. And Nixon ended up agreeing with him. Mel felt like he had skated on that one. The one he was more worried about was Secretary of Defense. So he had, through intricate means, he's a very shrewd guy, persuaded Nixon that he needed a Democrat in his candidate. And I hope whoever wins the election, you'll see at least one example of that in their cabinet. If it's a Republican who wins, I hope we see a Democrat in the candidate, and vice versa, because we need to move a little more to bipartisanship, or a great deal more, to get some things done. But he had persuaded him to select Henry Scoop Jackson, senator from the state of Washington. There was a problem with that. Scoop said, I'm willing to do this. He was a conservative Democrat when it came to foreign policy and military affairs. So it was really like picking a Republican in those issues. And the same thing will happen in the next couple of months. Whoever they pick of another party will still, that particular department, their view will reflect what the president believes and does. And Jackson said, I can't do this. Our hold in the Senate is small. I mean, our majority is small. I cannot do it if the Republican governor of Washington chooses a Republican to replace me as senator. If you can get the Republican governor to agree to replace me with a Democratic senator, then I will agree to be Secretary of Defense. Mel arranged that. It only took him a couple days. He was phenomenal in that way. But then Scoop went drinking with Ted Kennedy in Hawaii and some of the other Democratic leaderships, and Ted said, you can't go into Nixon's cabinet. You can never run for president if you become his Secretary of Defense. And Whatever happened at the time, besides the drinking, Scoop admitted there was a lot of drinking, he called Mel and said, "I'm sorry, I'm backing out." He had given his word. He was now backing out. There was only 2 or 3 days before the announcements were going to be made. At the time he called, Mel was with Nixon and Ford at the Republican Governors Association in Palm Springs, California, doing an event there. And Nixon was beside himself, and he started kind of screaming at Mel and saying, "You know, you got me into this situation, get me out of it." Mel was a little worried now. He thought he might be on the hook, and he was right. When they flew back to Andrews Air Force Base from Palm Springs, Nixon said, "You're going to have to be secretary." Mel said, "There's no way that I can do that. I'm better for you in Congress." Mel knew it was the end of his career. Who wants to be Secretary of Defense in the middle of a war when all 3 of your kids are against the war, and most of the people he picked for the Pentagon, all their kids were against the war? It was a mess, and they were going to have to be getting us out of a mess that the Johnson administration had gotten us into. So he tried to figure multiple ways to get out of it, and he finally came upon the perfect plan as each of them got more drunk, which Mel admitted. A lot of Manhattans later, about a half hour outside of Washington, Nixon pressed him again. He said, "All right, I will become Secretary of Defense if you agree to let me choose every person that works for me." No president before or since has ever given this. In fact, every president usually picks the Deputy Secretary of Defense, even if the Secretary of Defense doesn't want that man as his own deputy, because these are patronage positions. This is where you put campaign workers. You either make them ambassadors, or you put them in these cherry Pentagon jobs where they later can leave and work for a defense contractor, make beaucoup bucks, and unless their wealth is distributed, and have a happy life in their view. So Mel thought there's no way Nixon can agree to that. There's going to be so many positions that he wants to put people in. Nixon finally, because he probably was inebriated, as Mel said, finally said, "Okay." Well, Mel didn't necessarily trust his friend, Richard Nixon, for good reason. So he said, "You know, I'm still not going to agree to become secretary unless you put that pledge in writing. I want it in writing that I get to pick everyone." And so they looked around. There was no paper anywhere there. There was a cocktail napkin. So Nixon wrote on a cocktail napkin, "Mel Laird can pick every person who works for him." Mel used to keep it in his top pocket for a couple of years. Anytime somebody at the White House would call and say, "I want to have, the president wants this person in this, working for the Secretary of the Army." And Mel would say, "Well, as you well know, the president has pledged to me that I get this. So you can recommend. You can tell me who the president would like, and maybe I'll go along with it. But I may not. You can't tell me what to do." And it worked well. Unexpectedly, sometimes there are things when I was dealing with Mel that I wonder if he really realized the implications, because there were so many things with him like that pledge that made all the difference in the end, but no one could ever be that smart in the beginning to figure that out. And you never heard about anybody in the Pentagon being involved with Watergate. It's because Mel basically said to them in the beginning, "If any of you talks to the White House, except through my guy Carl Wallace, or through me," I mean, first of all, he'd say, "If anybody tells me in a meeting the White House wants something, I'm going to say you're nuts. The White House is a building. A building doesn't want anything. And if it's a person, the only person I care about is the president. If it's somebody else, they can ask through the president for something over here at the White House." So G. Gordon Liddy and some of those other guys were turned away at the door because they knew they had to go through Carl Wallace. John Warner, emotionally, he and John Chafee, Secretary of the Navy and the Deputy Secretary of the Navy, both with tears in their eyes years ago, John Chafee, 2 days before he died, tell me how grateful they were to Mel saving their political careers against their better judgment. Because Warner had Holden and Ehrlichman were friends of his, and they would call over, "We need a helicopter to go to a golf game," or whatever else. And understand, the Pentagon has all the toys. You're going to have Tim here next week, and that'll be a great talk, Tim Weiner, about the CIA. But ask him where all the intelligence employees really are. Ask him who are the majority of the intelligence employees, and you'll find out it's the Pentagon. National Security Agency is many times larger than the CIA. They also have, most of the satellites are theirs, very few are the CIA satellites. They're mostly owned by the Pentagon. Camp David, Melran, Air Force One. Where does that come from? The Air Force pilot, all the White House communication system. Anything that was expensive and was the Pentagon's. In fact, so much so, one of the things that Mel told me he never forgot, he went over to see Dwight Eisenhower after he had been selected, because this was a mentor of his, Ike, And he started saying, well, Dick said this, and here he was in Walter Reed Hospital. He said he practically came up set to a sitting position with all the IVs in him and started scolding me. He said, from now on, you've got to call him Mr. President. He's not Dick to you anymore. But then he found out that he had not met with President Johnson yet. And we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. We had 1.5 million people over there. So he thought it was imperative that the commander-in-chief should be briefing the new Secretary-elect of Defense. So Mel said, okay. Eisenhower called Johnson on the phone from the hospital and said, you got to meet with my friend Melvin Laird and tell him about the war, what you've been doing. And Johnson agreed, even though both Ford and Mel had been nipping at his heel for years on the Defense Appropriations Committee. Mel goes over there and he's prepared for a major one-on-one for an hour about the Vietnam War. He never forgot it because the entire half hour was on Johnson's perks. That's all he was concerned about, nothing about the Vietnam War. The first thing he said was, I've got this Navy steward, and I'd like to keep him, and I'd like to take him to Texas with me. And we need a helipad out in Texas for when I fly around. And we need this and that. Johnson was the one who changed the Sequoia, the presidential yacht, because he was tall, and he had a hunch over in the tower, so they built it like another half a foot down into the yacht itself. Mel was shocked that this was the only thing he was concerned about, but it also woke him up to how many goodies the Pentagon had to dole out that he was in charge of, and he did that with the yacht. He had some parties on that himself. So he gets in, and Nixon has partly won the election because he has a secret plan to end the war. I've been waiting for that this year. I wanted to hear just one of the candidates say, I have a secret plan to end the Iraq War, and I can't tell you about it because we can't tell the enemy what we're going to do, and then he'll do something else. But it didn't happen. So Mel becomes Secretary of Defense. He turns to Nixon and said, what's your secret plan? He says, I have none. It's you. So Mel invented, over the next couple of weeks, the thing that got us out of Vietnam. It will be, I guarantee you, the same thing that gets us out of Iraq. Whoever is elected president. At the time, he called it Vietnamization. It was his intent from the beginning to get Americans out to have the South Vietnamese fighting their own war. And no one had tried that before. The administration didn't trust the South Vietnamese, the Johnson administration, but he decided that they could do it. So he did things from the ground level up. Obviously, they had to, for instance, translate all the manuals into Vietnamese. The parts manuals for aircraft. You had to train people on how to deal with all this American weaponry so they could do it themselves. And he did that over time. In his view, he was successful. Because when he left in '73, they fought another 2 years until they basically ran out of ammunition. We stopped funding them, even at the same time as the Soviet Union was funding the North Vietnamese. But he was able to turn that over, despite the problems of corruption in the South Vietnamese military. But they did finally start promoting generals who knew what they were doing and were able to successfully fight. So that was one of his goals. Another goal was to end the draft. He had slipped a sentence in 40 years ago, in September 1968, into a radio address by Nixon, which Nixon just read without having read it before, in which he said it was a talk on the draft. But he stuck a sentence in that said, and if I become president, I pledge to end the draft. Well, they had a talk within the first week, and Mel said, how do you feel about this? He said, well, you stuck that sentence in there on me, and I'm not so happy about ending the draft, because we need these soldiers. We're in Vietnam. This is the easiest way to get them. Mel said, I'm very committed. Nixon said, well, let's go slow. I'll tell you what, I'll form a commission, a presidential commission to study it for the next couple of years. It's called the Gates Commission. Mel stacked the commission and challenged them privately to finish it up in 6 months, which they did, came out with a unanimous decision that the draft needed to be ended. The hardest thing for Mel in ending the draft, I mean, was very hard with the Army. The Army was used to, for the last 30 or 40 years, getting their people without any effort, just drafting them. But Mel felt that the draft was one of the most evil systems that the United States had ever invented because it was inequitable, because it meant the rich could avoid it, because of the student deferment. So he realized very early on that his greatest opposition would come from university presidents. Because the draft had changed America. Those of you who were that age at that time, baby boomers, will know this. It changed the way you viewed things. If you didn't want to go to Vietnam, you might join the anti-war movement. You definitely go to college, even if you didn't want to go to college. You might even go to divinity school, even though you shouldn't have a calling as a minister. You might even marry that girl when you might have waited 2 or 3 years. You might even have that first baby, just so you could get those successive deferments. Well, Mel felt like the first thing he had to do, he couldn't end it, it had taken him a few years to end the draft. First thing he had to do was make it equitable. So it was Mel that put through the draft lottery that occurred in December 1969. And that meant student deferments were no longer valid. It was all by numbers, all by the lottery. One of the things I felt saved me is I had a high number. I was glad I didn't have to go, and I've always honored Vietnam vets. Anytime I meet them, and wrote columns about it. And even after the Gulf War, I felt like most of those parades were for the Vietnam vets, for the way that they had been treated poorly. It's one of those things that has made a natural friendship with McCain over the years, not that I necessarily may vote for him. I'm not sure who yet. John McCain, one of the meetings I had with him when we go to the POWs, another big issue he had was Johnson administration had decided no one would speak about the POWs. Nobody really remembers that now, that there was an official policy. Not only that, the organization, the League of Families for Those Missing and Imprisoned in Southeast Asia, were specifically restricted from speaking publicly about their husband and family members over there. Because Averell Harriman, who was the negotiator over there with North Vietnamese, didn't want the POWs to become a negotiating chip. So he said, we will not talk about them. Mel came in and thought, this is wrong. I just feel this is wrong. Averell Harriman heard about it. He was still the negotiator because a new one hadn't been picked. So he came rushing over to the Pentagon after he went to the White House first and spoke with Mel for an hour and told him, you cannot go public on these POWs. You cannot, I know they're torturing them and I know they're doing these things, but you cannot make them a negotiating chip. And Mel said, I'll think about it a little longer. In May 1969, he went public. When he couldn't get the White House to do it, one of the things Harriman had told him was, you know, President Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger have both told me they 100% support this policy of not speaking about the POWs. So you should go along with your president. Mel said, I'll think about it. He tried to get the president to change his mind over the next 5 months, and then without informing the White House, he came out at a press conference with POW wives around him. It was not announced. It was a surprise to the reporters there, and just said, the North Vietnamese have our POWs over there. They're doing despicable things. They're torturing them. They're starving them to death. Here are 46 photos that we've sneaked out of North Vietnam, and you can see they're being starved, and their wounds aren't being treated. One of those 46 was John McCain. And over the next few months, as Mel put money, he sent the wives to the Paris peace delegations. He sent them to football games. He invented the bracelets, those things that you remember. The POW flag was behind that. All those things. He said, we have got to put pressure on them for violating the Geneva Convention. And the absolute result over the next 6 months is their treatment changed dramatically for the better. Their rations were quadrupled. Their torture diminished greatly. 95% of it was gone. There wasn't that much torture anymore. They started putting them in communal cells, not isolating them, so they now had hope. So John McCain said to me, as did all the other POWs, we felt when he made it a priority, the treatment of the POWs, he saved our lives, because there are many, including myself, no question, who would not have lasted the 4 years to return home if our treatment did not improve in 1969. And most of this he did. There's a chapter in the book that I really enjoyed writing called Dueling Machiavellis. It was just all the things between Kissinger and Laird. And Laird just liked to have fun with Kissinger, because this was a brilliant man with whom he agreed most of the time on the Soviet Union, on many of the key issues. So he was just trying, he felt like Henry needed a better sense of humor. So once when he came over to the Pentagon, Henry was always looking over his shoulder to read his briefing book. So Mel took some of Henry's memos and wrote in big red pencil, BS, but spelling it out. Knowing that when he came over to breakfast again, he'd look over and there would be his memos with this word written all over it. And he said, you know, that was the last time Henry ever looked at the memos anymore. He didn't say anything, but he never looked again. Camp David phones, everyone was convinced that he had a wiretap, especially Kissinger. Because they would call somebody, and within a half an hour, Mel would call either the president or Kissinger and say, you trying to get a hold of so-and-so? So they were convinced the Camp David operator was calling Mel, or it was wiretapped. And one of the things that I find interesting in life, I think you found this, is sometimes the people who complain the most or suspect someone else of something is because they're thinking of it themselves. So Kissinger and Haldeman and Ehrlichman naturally would think Mel might wiretap them because pretty soon Kissinger was wiretapping his own aides. And not just that, he wanted to know what Mel was up to. And he knew he couldn't wiretap Mel, so he wiretapped his military aide's home phone, so he could find out every time he had a conversation with Mel Laird. Now, the FBI wasn't too sharp then. They thought Mel was carrying on an affair with some lady named Catherine Graham, based on phone conversations. They could not figure out in 1970 who this guy Buzz Aldrin was, a man who had walked on the moon 9 months before. So it wasn't like they found out great things. Besides the wiretapping, the most interesting thing I found, a lot of interesting things, but the shocking thing that shocked Kissinger as well. We both learned a lot during that interview, and the biggest thing I learned is when I said to him, Mel said he always knew what you were up to because you were using Air Force planes, and his military assistant over at the White House is a good friend of his. I know you always ordered them not to tell the Secretary of Defense, but some of them did. However, he also knew what you were saying in the negotiations with the North Vietnamese. And Kissinger said he couldn't have known. There were no notes. I didn't take any notes, and I was the only American in them. And I said, well, Dr. Kissinger, with respect, he says there were intercepts by the National Security Agency that when the North Vietnamese they would report on what had happened in the meeting, and these were accurate reports, no propaganda, because they were telling their superiors in Hanoi. This is precisely what Henry Kissinger said. And they would send this cable to Hanoi, heavily encrypted. And then a cable would come back and saying, we've gotten your cable, we see what's in here, this is what we want you to do next during the next negotiation. So it was the game plan also from Hanoi. And Kissinger said, no. If there were such intercepts, I, the National Security Advisor, and the chief negotiator for the United States, however secret, would have known about it. And I said, yeah, you would have. I'm going to ask Mel about it again. I thought you knew. And that's what we were going to talk about, how you felt about that. Well, about an hour after I got in the hotel room, Mel called me and said, what did you do to upset Henry? He was furious. I said, well, what was he furious about? He said, the NSA intercepts. I said, yeah, he didn't know that you had them or were reading them. He said, yeah, I guess I didn't realize until he called me just now that he never knew about them. And it's one of those times as a biographer, yes, it's authorized, but we had a lot of pitched battles, and there are things in the book he didn't want in there because he had asked me to help him do it because he knew as an investigative reporter and I was going to stick by my guns. I said, frankly, I have to take Dr. Kissinger's side on this one. Why wasn't he seeing that? Was this gamesmanship on your part? He said, no, I explained it to him just now, and he understood. I said, explain it to me on the biography. He said, well, the National Security Agency would send a courier over with this transcript or what had been sent back from Hanoi. I would read it and then send the courier over to the Oval Office. I don't report to Henry Kissinger. He was the National Security Advisor. He wasn't even in the cabinet at the time. And he's not in my chain of command. My chain of command goes direct to the President. So I give it to the President. If the President chooses to share it with Kissinger, that's fine. It's his National Security Advisor. And there was this long silence. I said, Mel, are you telling me the President of the United States did not share these transcripts and these this indication of what was going to happen in the next negotiation with his own negotiator? He said, that's correct. I said, how can this be? He said, well, it was the way things were back then. I called Larry Eagleberger, who had worked for Kissinger a lot of years and was good friends with Mel, and said, is this possible that this thing could happen? He started laughing and said, absolutely. Don't you see what Nixon was doing? And this is why Henry's upset now, because he had talked to him about it in the last few days before I called Eagleberger. It meant that it was Dick Nixon's way of keeping track of Kissinger. That if Kissinger came back from the negotiations and said, I said this and this and this, and I was tough on this and this and this, and it wasn't in the transcript, he knew Kissinger wasn't telling him the truth. And he said, B, it was his way to look a whole lot smarter than Henry Kissinger. Because he would tell him in those same meetings, I think the next time they may raise this and this and this, and you probably ought to do this and this and this. I said, that kind of significantly changes history, doesn't it? He said, that's correct. I said, as I recall, Dr. Kissinger's memoirs, raved about how brilliant Nixon was, particularly in predicting what the North Vietnamese were going to do in the negotiations. But he had the inside plan. He said, that's right. That was the way it was back then, the games that were being played. One of my favorite stories, and I just like to read you this, is that kind of tells you the difference between them, is the Pope story, I call it. They were all over on a European trip. This was 1970. And Laird was asked to bring a military helicopter to St. Peter's Square to pick up the president. But he was specifically ordered by, particularly Henry Kissinger, not to meet with the Pope. No American Secretary of Defense at the height of the Vietnam War should meet with the Pope, because he's a man of peace. Now, never mind that Kissinger was signing bombing orders, and Nixon was the commander-in-chief of that war. But no, the taint was on the Secretary of Defense. He was going to take the hit. So Mel agreed to that. But the President and Dr. Kissinger got caught in traffic for about an hour and a half. And the Pope found out the Secretary of Defense was out there at the helicopter and invited him in. So by the time the President and Kissinger come in, Mel's in animated conversation with the Pope. And this is the way Laird put it. He said, they were shocked to see me sitting there next to the Pope, but I moved over, you know, so that there would be room for these dignitaries. One of Kissinger's aides, Lawrence Eagleburger, recalled the moment and said Kissinger was humorless. Henry was convinced that when Mel was told they didn't want the defense secretary or the Pope, that Mel did this helicopter exercise purely and simply so he could get Henry. This was an aspect of the acute competition between them. That night on the USS Saratoga, during the dinner with everyone, Laird was still flushed with his coup over Kissinger and the advance men. So he regaled the assembled dignitaries, including Nixon and Kissinger, with details of his papal encounter. He said the invitation to enter had caught him by surprise. He said, so he had to quickly tuck the cigar he had been puffing into his suit coat pocket. Then, surrounded by papal functionaries, he noticed his pocket was smoking. Laird said he began slapping at it so hard that others in the company started politely applauding, thinking that they had missed something profound from the Pope. When Laird told the story to the President in his dinner guest, he swore that the smoke led some to speculate that the College of Cardinals was electing a new pontiff. Nixon and the others roared with laughter as Laird skillfully blurred the line between fact and fiction. He later insisted he had couched the whole thing as a joke, but he did not realize he had been taken literally until Kissinger published his memoirs in 1979 and passed the story off as true. Moreover, Kissinger's account says he was an eyewitness to the event that never happened, to the point of claiming he had wisely urged Laird at least to do away with the cigar while we were in the papal presence. So when you're reading Dr. Kissinger's memoir, just remember the Pope story. The thing that about their competition the first couple of years that was, a lot of it was fun, but I ended up summarizing what Laird wanted was quite often the same as what Kissinger wanted, but four major exceptions became evident in the first year. Laird wanted sizable and swift American troop withdrawals from Vietnam. Dr. Kissinger admitted to me that Mel deserved the prize more for peace than him. He said, Mel was the one who dictated the peace because I could not keep up with his withdrawals. I was barely able to get the peace accord signed by the time he had withdrawn all the American troops. So it was almost de facto. And he did that starting in the first year. Midway meeting in June of '69, Kissinger said, maintain to Nixon, and Nixon agreed at first, we will not withdraw a single American until we get a concession from them or a peace treaty. Which means we still would have had 1.5 million people there 4 years later, because the North Vietnamese still would have dragged it out. Mel saw the writing on the wall. So he insisted, even to the point that they knew he would resign. When they went to the Midway meeting, he insisted President Nixon announce the first withdrawals. He did not want to be Secretary of Defense and be increasing. On his desk when he came in was a request from William Westmoreland for 200,000 more troops, which had not been denied by the previous president. So he wanted to withdraw. He said 50,000. They debated for weeks. Finally, Nixon said, all right, I'm not going to do zero, like Dr. Kissinger says, I'll give you 25,000. Kissinger told me he knew it was all over then. And in a famous memo he wrote the following September called the Salted Peanuts Memo, he said the same thing to me. He said, I knew the American public. Once you withdrew, the first person would be like eating salted peanuts. Americans would never be satisfied until the whole bag was gone, until all the American soldiers were home. Number two, national acknowledgement of the POWs and international pressure for more humane treatment 3, unhesitating movement from the draft to an all-volunteer force, which occurred. Draft ended at the time he left. And 4, Mel didn't win on this, a commitment to open government, which fully informs the public on all important matters. But even this thing that I donated to the Ford library, it is not illegal. It comes out of the Pentagon Papers and comes from something Mel did. It was just behind the scenes. He was doing so many things. Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Saved the Green Bay Packers because he made a deal when he realized the 2 football leagues were going to combine and they'd need a waiver on antitrust legislation. He brokered a deal with Senator Russell Long of Louisiana and Hale Boggs in their 2 committees. He talked to them behind the scenes and said, what is it you want? Well, we might be able to go along with a new NFL and a waiver of the antitrust agreement. We've always felt there ought to be a team in New Orleans. Well, Mel felt like they had to have this deal, revenue sharing, or small teams from small places like Green Bay would lose out over time unless all the revenue is shared. It's not in baseball, but in football they share all the sports paraphernalia, everything is shared. The broadcast, the only thing that changes is the house gate for when the games are actually played. 60% goes to the hosting team. And he was only doing to save the Green Bay Packers, but as a result, the New Orleans Saints were formed. But Pentagon Papers, Mel was ticked, because first of all, he thought they ought to be leaked. He saw them, thought they ought to be leaked. It was despicable what the Johnson administration had done behind the scenes, and this was all their history. But he was not the leaker. Henry Kissinger thought he was, and yelled at him and called him all kinds of names for 2 or 3 days, saying, you must have been the one that leaked it. Mel said he wasn't opposed to the leak, because only a small percentage of it deserved to be classified. But what upset him was that he couldn't get them named the McNamara Papers. Here he was, the Secretary of Defense. He didn't want people to think this was his Pentagon doing all these secret things. He wanted them to be called the McNamara Papers. And then behind the scenes, when Dr. Kissinger and Nixon pressed the government to prosecute the New York Times heavily for printing classified information, Mel called his friend, the Solicitor General, Erwin Griswold, and said, you're going to need a lot of testimony from our experts. I am now telling you confidentially, I'm going to drag my heels. We should not be prosecuting this case. I believe in freedom of the press. They have a right to publish it. And I am not going to give you one expert that says anything in there was seriously classified that they wrote about. It's all history. And it deserved to be made public. So Griswold backed off. And nobody ever knew that this call had happened behind the scenes, that the Solicitor General had been told his case would be totally undercut by the people he was supposedly prosecuting for. As a result, the decision in the end was it's not illegal for a reporter to have classified documents or even print information from those classified documents as long as they are copies. If they're originals, we can be arrested for stolen documents. But the person that leaked it to us can be arrested, can lose their job and be arrested if they had clearance. One of the funny things about finally donating these papers is years worth of, well, it was a lot of stuff, but it was tens of thousands of pages of top secret and higher documents. And when I finally called the person who works for our line, David Horrocks, and said, you know, I really want to get rid of these. I've been hiding them all over the house for the last 15 years. And there's no better place than to give them to scholars, because I know you'll never get any of this from the CIA, so at least you can force them to declassify some of it. David said, fine, I'll send a truck around. I don't know if it was GSA. But now in my little cul-de-sac, here comes this armored truck. These guards knock on the door, you know, I've got these documents there, and you know, they're acting very serious. This is top secret stuff. It's never been declassified. I said, yeah, I've just kind of bored with it for the last few years. Used all that I wanted to. And so he took it from me, and just to test him, I thought this was going to be funny. He didn't have a good sense of humor. Must be the GSA. I said, this is after I had signed him over to him. I said, wait a minute, there's a document there that I want to see. He said, Mr. Van Atta, you are not cleared to see these documents. You have no authorization. They will go under lock and key to the Ford Library and we'll get them declassified. Well, that's our government. I've kind of gone all over the block when you see if I missed anything. There was, at the end, before we go to some questions, among the more serious things Mel did, more than anyone else, he made Gerald Ford president. And interestingly, he had the choice to become president himself first. Ford was even behind it. Basically, you had the situation where Mel Laird leaves government in January 73. He is sick of it. In fact, when he became Secretary of Defense, he said no person in the United States should ever be Secretary of Defense more than one term. If they're there more than one term, they go bad. And he was referencing McNamara and another one before McNamara, but when he was talking with me about it, he said, look at Caspar Weinberg, look at my friend Don Rumsfeld. It's a one-term job. You don't stay there a second term. So in his first press conference, he said, I've ordered the taxi that's coming to the door on January 19th, 1973, whoever is elected president at that time. Glad to get out of government. 5 months later, Capitol Hill, Gerald Ford, all the leaders, Republican and Democrat, come to his house and beg him to become the new domestic counselor because John Ehrlichman and H.R. Haldeman have just resigned because they're going to be indicted. So they need somebody clean over there that everybody trusts, that has integrity. And they need them over there fast. So he and Bryce Harlow were talked into going over there. Mel first called his friend who was Nixon's lawyer at the time, Fred Buzzard, who had more loyalty to Mel than the president because he had been the general counsel of the Pentagon, Mel's pick, for 4 years over at the Pentagon. And he said, he met with him and said, are you vouching for him? Is he clean on this Watergate stuff? Fred Buzzard said, absolutely he's clean. Don't worry about it, accept it. Mel's wife and mother, who didn't like Nixon, were still said, you cannot accept this unless you ask Nixon personally in 1973 if he was involved in the cover-up. So he went out to Camp David and put it to Nixon personally. And Nixon said, no, absolutely not, I have nothing to do with it. So he accepts. 2 weeks into being there, Fred Buzzard calls him and said, we need to meet at this secret place. The president's lawyer then tells him the president's guilty, which calls for disbarment, right? Those of you who know lawyers, because he's just found out over the last few days there are tapes. And as the president's lawyer, he's been the first to listen to the tapes, and he's heard the smoking gun tape. And he knows if the tapes continue to exist, Nixon is guilty. He's guilty, and he may be found guilty in the end. And he doesn't give Mel all the details. Mel just said he felt like his life was ending almost because he had just come into the White House. But now he wanted to get out as fast as he could. But first he felt, I'm going to talk to the president. So that same day, when the president was walking across from the White House to his secret office, the executive office building, his hideaway that he went to in late afternoon, he buttonholed the president and said, you lied to me. You told me you were not involved. I know you were involved. And Richard Nixon knew Mel well, that if he said he knew something, and especially since he himself knew he was guilty, then Mel must know it. He didn't even ask who the source was. And he just didn't say anything. I said, I can't imagine this meeting, Mel. What did he finally say? He said, well, it was typical President Nixon. All he said was, are you going to stay? Didn't deny it. It was useless. Are you going to stay as domestic counsel? Mel wanted out. He called some friends on the Hill and said, I can't tell you why, but I have got to get out of this place as fast as possible. There were stories in the press. I went back and looked. When Mel told me, Buzzard had told me, I'd never heard this story. I went back in the press and it turned out there were stories saying he was going to leave. Gerald Ford and the others came down to his house again and begged him to stay. And he finally agreed. And then his speeches started referencing Thomas Paine, being a summer soldier or a sunshine patriot. He felt like, okay, more sacrifice for the country, I'm going to do it now. Well, in September comes his golden opportunity to really do something big. And because Agnew's leaving for under a cloud. He's taken a bribe even while he was vice president, a payoff. And he's going to be indicted. And instead of being indicted, we're going to have him resign as vice president of the United States. Mel knows he only has a couple days. He knows that for Nixon, there's only one choice. Anybody remember of Nixon's choice? There was no one even close to this man. If there was a field of 10, the 9 secondary people altogether wouldn't have been close to the first pick. A man named John Connally, a former governor of Texas who had been shot, as well as Kennedy, during that 1963 thing, had become Secretary of the Treasury, even though he was a Democrat, had changed to become a Republican. Now, I don't know if Nixon felt like, he loved Connally, and I don't know if in the back of his mind he knew, if I choose Connally, Congress will never impeach me, because they'll never confirm Connally as vice president. And they will not impeach someone if there's no viable vice president. As soon as he has a viable vice president, he's impeachable. So you have someone to replace him. Well, do you think the Democrats on Capitol Hill wanted to confirm John Connally, who's now become a Republican? Do you think the Republicans who now see this former Democrat become a Republican? Trust him either? No, neither side did. And behind the scenes, the Melt Fund was starting to percolate, so it would have been confirmation hearings that ran a year or two before, unless his name was withdrawn. Mel got a call from Ford and a couple others on the Hill, and they said, Mel, we want you to become vice president. We can get it through here, and we can arrange to have Nixon do this. We feel we can pressure him into it. Basically tell him we will not confirm John Connally. We will confirm this one person. We all have to coalesce on this. And Mel thought about it for a very brief time, called everyone except Ford, and said, absolutely not. It's Jerry Ford. That's who needs to be vice president. He's the best candidate. He's the best thing for this country at the time. He also felt like as soon as Ford was chosen, he could get out of the White House. They didn't need a domestic counselor who could get a budget bill through Capitol Hill. They'll have Jerry Ford. He could get it through. So he saw it as his exit strategy, if you want to call it that. And so he did convince Nixon. And there was a New York Times reporter who followed his every move, wrote a memoir later, and said it was Mel more than anyone else. And Ford knew that. When I did an interview with him, he said the same thing. So he puts Ford in. A couple months later, he puts in Leon Jaworski as a special prosecutor in the wake of the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon never even knew he knew Jaworski. But Mel arranged for 5 or 6 people to call him and say, Jaworski will be fair, he's very trusted, and he'll do it. And Jaworski comes in, a man who forces the tapes to become public. And then, not satisfied with all that, he's only leaving in a month or so, he ends up choosing the chief counsel of the Watergate impeachment committee. The man that's really going to gather all the evidence. Wisconsinite, he calls Pete Rodino, a Democrat, as White House domestic counsel and said, I know you've had hundreds of applications because there's a lot of lawyers who would like to have this on their resume, that they brought a president down. But the fairest man that you can put in, and the best man, is Frank Dorr, who was in the Kennedy administration, but is a Wisconsinite and a protege of mine. He's a great, independent, trusted person. Rodino immediately snatched up on it, and the next day, when he announced in the press conference that he had chosen Dorr, he only referred to one person. Somebody asked him, how do the Republicans feel about this? You need someone bipartisan. You can't just look like the Democrats going against Richard Nixon. He said, well, White House domestic counsel, Nixon's own domestic counsel, recommended him to me. So, of course, he's going to be fair. It was interesting to close that January, something I had forgotten until they had faxed to me today. Kind of in keeping with what I started out as. Laird and Ford, now Ford is the vice president, it's January 1974, and they go to accept this award for work on mental retardation in Providence, Rhode Island. There's this group called Attica Brigade that hears they're coming, so they're going to put on this big demonstration. Now, this is a year after the peace accord has been signed. So the day they're there, about 150 picketers marched in a circle for more than an hour in front of the student center before Ford and Laird arrived. As they stepped out of their limousine, the chants reached full fury. Humanitarian, we say no, Melvin Laird has to go. Melvin Laird, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide. Ford, Laird, better start shaking. Today's pigs are tomorrow's bacon. And another sign, give Laird a war prize. And then when the police started to move them back, they started tossing dozens of eggs, tomatoes, and snowballs at Vice President Ford and Laird. Neither of them was struck, although 2 policemen were hit. Laird was burned in effigy. This is a year after. When I asked Ford about and Laird, they said the irony was they were the ones who were most forceful within the Nixon administration for letting the protesters protest, for letting them do these things, that they would be pilloried for this. And that's the way it goes. Thank you very much. I'll meet with any of you out there when we're doing the book signing and talk further. Yes?
What did he tell you about McNamara?
Mel really respected McNamara in the beginning, but his gut feeling was that McNamara didn't care about people, and that he lied to him about the Tonkin Gulf. Once he found out he lied to him about the Tonkin Gulf incident, he hammered him in the Defense Appropriations Committee, so much so that McNamara at one point started screaming at him, cursing at him, and leaped across the table to try to hit him. McNamara, of all people. So I think, when he asked the question, I think of what he said later to me when McNamara's memoir came out, The Apology, which he felt was appropriate because he should have apologized, because what he was agreeing to was what Mel and Jerry Ford had done in their white papers each year on the Vietnam War. the real facts versus what the McNamara was saying. But he said what disturbed him the most was always what disturbed him about McNamara, that he'd do this full apology and not once in the book reference the soldiers and their sacrifice and their courage. He said, I cannot imagine doing something like that without saying, nevertheless, these young men and women who went over there were the best America had to offer. And if you notice, you'll notice in my book with honor that that's who the dedication is to. The vast majority of Vietnam veterans who performed honorably and courageously and did not get credit for it. So that's the deal with McNamara. Anything else? Have I counted you? Have hope. Thank you very much.
They're just eager for dessert.
Yes.
We have another present for you. Thank you so much. You don't have to open here. This is very little bitty sitting. We had to think of a second present because he got
Yes,
one when he was
I
at the
got
library.
it.
You got it. Got it. Yes. I'm glad you came. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. This was the second time around with some different twists on the stories. As I said, I learned a lot. I learned some more tonight, and I hope you'll take the opportunity to talk to Dale while you're here.